Hey guys, Nick Piper here. I'm leading the discussion today, and I'm going to focus primarily on the optional readings, Herman Kellenben's The Impact of Growth on Government, The Example of Spain, and Stanley G. Payne's A History of Spain and Portugal, Volume 1, Chapter 9, The United Spanish Monarchy. Uh, I would like to include a little bit from one of the required readings, Douglas C. North's Nobel Prize lecture, and that is his idea of time. Uh, I'll admit I didn't really understand a lot of what his lecture was talking about. I'm by no means an economist, but his idea about time is very important for this discussion. Time is the dimension in which the learning process of human beings shapes the way institutions evolve, knowledge is transferred through generations, is cumulative, and beliefs play a part. Uh, and that brings me to my first discussion question. How much could these monarchs have known the effects of their policies, specifically on financial matters? And we'll see some examples of that here in a moment. It's easy for us to say, with our hindsight, that reform X caused problem Y, but how much could these monarchs have known the effects of their various policies on their economy? The focus of both articles tends to be on the idea that the Catholic monarchs didn't actually unite Spain. It was unity in name only through marriage. Aragon and Castile maintained very different monetary policies, customs, and duties and taxes, and true unification didn't happen until the 1700s under the Bourbons. Even though the Catholic monarchs did start to centralize some of the power, the main issues during their reign were a weak economy, poor interior market, and low stage of industrial development. And a lot of people point to gold and silver from the Americas really boosting Spain's economy and giving them the wealth they needed to expand. But because of their internal situation, it really forced Spain to export a lot of the metals, and they were used to finance wars in various other places, Italy, the Netherlands, etc. Um, a lot of internal problems kept Spain also down as far as internal economy goes. And Aragon, for example, the taxation there didn't really keep up with inflation, and as a result there was no real gains, and they actually began to contribute a lot less in terms of actual value. The highest form of income in Spain at the time was the 10% sales tax, but after 1525, the courts, specifically in Castile, gained the right to approve and increase the rate of customs or sales taxes and substituted annual fixed sums for individual duties. As a result of this, the proportional value of sales taxes actually began to decline. The alcabala, the sales tax, didn't really provide enough for the crown's military needs, so they had to request a servicio, and this was regular demand every 3 years. Uh, and because of the revolts being quelled previously, uh, the crown really had its way with this. They got their payments, but they allowed the urban aristocracy to distribute the tax burden as they saw fit, and this primarily rested on the middle and lower classes. And the tax burden is not really desirable from the crown's point of view, because it weakened the kingdom's internal economy, which they were only vaguely aware of, and it restricted the tax burden to only a portion of the kingdom's wealth. Uh, Another issue that sort of begins with the Catholic monarchs and ties into our discussion question is the Inquisition, which one of the authors argues is the only real radical institution they create in Spain, and that it led to an acute scarcity in capital, and this is primarily because of the expulsion of the Jews and later the Moriscos and persecution of conversos and new Christians. Uh, they were really an economically capable and active part of the population, and their persecution and expulsion created a loss of eternal economy. Same with the Moriscos later, they were persecuted and expelled, and it really created negative impacts on the internal capabilities of Spain and kind of held them back. The the real issues with Spain's economy don't really take place until Charles V. He kind of failed to unify Spain's taxation system and financial administration, or establish a regular budget, and the rigid revenue system failed to meet the demands Charles generated through his ambitious policies. Uh, continued the he continued the consumption tax of 10% and levied the servicio every 3 years like they had in the past. And he starts to get some other income, confiscations from the Inquisition, indulgences, gains in the fight against the Turks, and treasures coming from America. Money comes from places like Aragon, Castile, Italy, Burgundy, and the Netherlands. And although the income increased, it couldn't keep up with his ambitious policies. The taxes came in too slowly, and he resorted to credit, specifically credit given by Genoese and Germans. He also tried to increase revenue by mining, increasing shipping licenses, but ultimately the credit he relied on is a very expensive form of income. Estimates say there was a 12 to 14% return on the credit, and that resulted in a yearly average of almost 40% interest, and that created a constantly widening gap between demand and income. The main issues Spain was facing during this time were a weak economy, poor interior market, low stage of industrial development, and a lot of people argue that the money coming in from the Americas, particularly the gold and silver, really helped Spain as far as accumulation of wealth and expansion, but it, Spain was really forced to export the metals and to use them to finance wars in other places because of their poor interior markets. And by the time of Philip II, the empire is really broken up. He's really focused on defending Naples and Sicily from the Turks. The Spanish Armada is lost, which is a huge hit. There's a new war with France, and more opposition to the Moorish Morisco population, another example of a skilled, industrious people being persecuted. And he had to deal with the debt that Spain was incurring. He stopped payments on a floating debt of about 7 million ducats, and by 1575, the consolidated debt had reached over 22 million ducats, and he had to send a lot of money to Netherlands and Sicily, or to the Netherlands and Sicily to defend against the Turks. And by 1598, revenues are almost 10 million ducats, but there is a 1.6 million deficit that is continuing to grow. And he takes even more measures against New Christians and Moriscos that hurt the internal economy. These are just a few examples of some of the internal conflicts Spain faces during this period, and I really want to tie this into the original discussion question. How much did these monarchs know the effects of what they were doing? I mean, Charles was using most of his money to try to maintain the gains Spain had accrued. Uh, Same with Philip II. And it doesn't seem like they could ever turn the tide. The amount of money being spent and lost by the empire was never, during this period, was never returned in any significant way. For example, the credit that they were getting from Genoese and Germans might have seemed like a good idea at the time, but when it came time to pay, we really see otherwise, that a yearly average of 40% interest and a constantly widening gap between demand and income as a result just is not something you can maintain. And I want to ask you guys again, how much could they have known the effects of their policies? Thanks. And if you want a lot more background information on Castile and Aragon, I definitely recommend reading The United Spanish Monarchy, Stanley G. Payne's A History of Spain and Portugal, Volume 1, Chapter 9, The United Spanish Monarchy. It's very interesting and very dense, but it'll help give a lot of background information for why various policy measures were taken, um, internal conflicts, strife between aristocracy and peasantry. And then it really sort of sets the stage for the world that the Catholic monarchs Charles and Philip face. Thanks again, and I'll be posting on the discussion here